There's a book titled The Devil and Karl Marx, Communism's Long March of Death and Deception. And I believe that gets at the root of a lot of confusing and seemingly completely, nonsensical policies that are coming from what we would call the far left. I believe that this association or this correlation between Marxism, communism, socialism, and the devil and Satanism is actually a sound correlation, that there is actually truth to that. And by understanding that connection, it demystifies all of this seemingly nonsense, policy and rhetoric that is coming from what we would call today the far left. Similarly, along these lines, in a critique of Bolshevism, which was a form of Soviet Marxism-Leninism in Russia, who were focused on establishing this centralized party, to seize power, and then supposedly, after seizing power, establish social justice or equity being defined as justice and fairness, right? In a critique of Bolshevism, this correlation or this connection between this ideology and and Satanism, or and the demonic, was made. And so I'm going to read that quote to you now. The positive significance of Bolshevism, and again, remember, Bolshevism is referring to Marxism, communism. So the positive significance of Bolshevism may be that having removed the mask and showed everyone Satan in his undisguised form, he led many through confidence in the reality of Satan to faith in God, end quote. And this was 1925. This was said in 1925 in Berlin in the Eurasian Times. So the quote is saying that this Marxism, this communism coming to the surface in society, has shown people, Satanism in practice on a social level, and that it has a positive, you could say, silver lining, in that it's actually turned people to the creator, to the opposite of the enemy, to the opposite of Satan, Satan being the enemy of the creator. So that is just kind of the overarching view to keep in mind. And I'm now going to attempt to explain exactly, why this perspective is accurate. It may seem, out there to you. It may seem like a totally outlandish claim, and I can understand that. Initially, that's probably something you never heard before. It's not like this book, The Devil and Karl Marx, is being given at universities for students to study, or it's not like the history of communism really, killing over 100 million people in the 20th century alone. History of Stalinism, Pol Pot, Lenin, Mao, like the mass killings and torture and prison camps, and it's not like university students really are being given all these historical details, right? They're all being glossed over, and socialism, communism is actually being more painted in a good light. It's being made out to be something actually good. But that gets into the propaganda aspect of um, Marxism, communism, which I'll address in a little while. Um, but first, I just wanted to clarify terms here and simplify them. So, we have socialism, we have communism. Socialism basically being, the transition to communism, and then Marxism, Leninism. But I think it's, and even now we have the term wokeism, right, which is really just a label that is describing the far left, which are basically just putting forth communist ideas, as I'll be explaining more. But I think a better term that kind of covers all the bases that would be best to use is actually statism. So statism is just the fundamental idea that the state is our God and Savior, right? Like the state is the solution to all problems. So the state is always seen as the means to making the world a better place. So politicians, political parties, the whole state apparatus is seen as the solution, is seen as the way forward for humanity. It's the foundation of a civilized society, and it's how we can keep progressing forward. Right? So statism is this form of idolatry, wherein rather than looking to the Creator as the true authority, as the moral authority, the state has taken the Creator's place. And for anyone familiar with the New Testament, this has a basis there as well. So there's the story of, or there's the writings on when Jesus was tempted, or when the devil attempted to tempt Jesus in the desert. And one of the ways he tried to tempt Jesus was by offering him all of the kingdoms of the world. So this is oftentimes overlooked, I think, because the word kingdoms is like not really used in modern times. So we kind of may just, skim over the word and not really think about what that means in modern language. But it means, a fair translation would actually be governments, right? Kingdoms of the world are all of the territories which have rulers, rulers over populations. And so we could call those today states or governments, states being the best term because that's referring to a governing body that is based on violence, based on extortion, otherwise known as taxation, right? Some folks will say, oh, government, you can govern or organize and manage, your own household, or so on and so forth. And they'll try and confuse or divert attention away from what's really being talked about here, what the real problem is, or what, kind of government is being discussed, which is really states, which are extortion-based social systems. So the devil was offering these to Jesus, right? So think about that. If the devil was able to offer these to Jesus, that means he was in control of them, right? He couldn't offer them if he didn't have them. And Jesus didn't say, oh, you're not in control of these. He just rejected the offer, right? So it was, you could say, a real offer. He was actually trying to tempt Jesus to, submit to him. That's what he wanted him to do, to kneel to him, right? Submit to his power and control, and and authority, is, so-called authority. So we have right there in that passage, basically the whole dynamic, which is what, like I was saying from the start, is this connection between the devil and statism, right? Which nowadays is just kind of thought only as a problem in the far left version, being, Marxism and communism. But actually, statism encompasses both left and right. It's not just Marxism, it's actually the whole social system based on extortion that claims a monopoly on violence and claims a right to rule people, right? So this is the idea that some humans have actually this divine authority to rule over others, right? And Christians will say exactly that. I just came across in a book, a Christian book, a portion that just mentioned government, and they pretty much all say the same thing. And this author said, quote, "Government is God's idea. He put people in authority to implement a system of rule." And so this is false, and it's actually blasphemous. The idea that God put in place all of the rulers of humanity who have committed the most horrible atrocities, right? Like I already mentioned, Stalin. You could mention, of course, Hitler, Pol Pot, all throughout Caesar, all throughout history, all of these tyrants and rulers. And in the Bible too, you have Saul, which is interesting to read about because in the Old Testament, God is actually discouraging the people to take on a king. He's saying, "I should be your king," but yet the people were insistent. No, we want a king. And then this king turned out to be very destructive, right? Deceptive and homicidal, and it turned out to not go well, as historically, it continued to not go well. So this idea that God is installing all of these leaders, whether they take the position of power supposedly legitimately, or if they steal the election, or if they just take it by force, somehow every single time that happens, every time any ruler gets propped up, takes power anywhere on earth, he has somehow God's stamp of approval. It's just a crazy thought. It's just totally nonsensical. How could you have a good God that would put his stamp of approval on all of these people doing horrible, abusive things? It's contradictory, and like I said, it's actually blasphemous. Let me just read to you this the passage in 1 Samuel. So this is chapter 12 in 1 Samuel. So 1 Samuel 12, verse 12. It says, "Even though the Lord your God is your king, you told me, this time it's different. We want a king to rule us." And then down in going into verses 21 and 22, "Don't worship idols. They don't have any power and they can't help you or save you when you're in trouble. But the Lord has chosen you to be his own people. He will always take care of you so that everyone knows how great he is." End quote. So we're told to not have idols and instead trust in God, right? But instead we put our trust in states. And then, of course, they issue us currency here in the United States that says, "In God we trust," which I think is, very deceptive, right? Because the very institution itself is showing a mistrust in God. And one final note just on the religious and Christian front. It seems many Christians will just, either refer to the writings of Paul, who I consider, and many others consider, a false apostle. They'll refer to one of his letters, a letter to the Romans, saying that all governments were instituted by God. So they say, oh, well, this guy Paul said it, and Paul also said that everything he said is inspired from God. So therefore, words out of his mouth are equivalent to God's word. It's the word of God. So therefore, it's true. So that's just, again, idolatry of this man. So they'll point to that as supposed justification for all states for all time. Or they'll say, well, Jesus said to give to Caesar what's Caesar's, and give to God what's God, what belongs to God. The statement by Jesus is in no way can it be rationally construed to equal an endorsement of all governments for all time. He was saying, okay, show me this coin. In the context, they were trying to entrap him to arrest him. And so he said, okay, show me the coin. And then, who's this on the coin? Oh, Caesar? Okay, so this is Caesar's coin? Okay, well, return to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and, return to God what belongs to God. So he gave a brilliant answer that also served the purpose of evading arrest at that time, because that was not what he wanted to happen at that time. That was not God's will for him at that moment to be arrested. He wanted to continue his ministry and his work, his healing work. But yet Christians will say, well, he said, render to Caesar, so therefore all governments are legitimate. All governments are approved by God. Like, talk about putting words into someone's mouth, right? He in no way said all governments are legitimate and ordained by God. Paul did say that, but Paul is not Jesus. Paul is not the Word of God. Paul is, should be considered a questionable apostle, to put it mildly. So that's what I just wanted to say on an introductory portion here about kind of the big picture. And now I'll get into more of the details of how statism, Marxism, communism plays out, and how it all is serving the same fundamental purpose, which is just to give the state more power, right? The devil wants control over humanity, wants to rule humanity, wants to go against God's creation. So that's the main theme that will just be repeatedly surfacing, in all of these different policies and ideas that are pushed on people, especially lately, to an extreme degree, particularly through public education and, of course, the media and entertainment. So what is communism fundamentally? Well, Marx himself simplified it by saying, well, it's about the abolition of private property, right? And the abolition of the individual. He was against the idea of an individual rights, and against the idea of private property, right? So that's key to understand, because that actually points us to what the solution to all of this mess is, which is actually the establishment and the recognition and establishment of individual property rights, including your own body as your own property and your own individual rights. So, it's fundamentally a small group of people who consider themselves the rightful rulers of humanity. They want to dominate humanity. They want to subject them to taxation. They want to strip them of their fundamental property rights. And they want them to assimilate into a collective, of course, a collective that is supposedly representative of social justice, of equity and fairness for all. They want everyone to assimilate to this collective, which of course they control, but the people duped by the philosophy think, well, actually we're in control. It's the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? Which actually isn't so dissimilar to the idea of we the people, right? That the government is actually us, right? When they're not. they're they're the extortionists. You're the ones being, subject to extortion. It's quite a difference just on that front alone. So the interesting thing here about the property rights too is to again look at this in, you could say, a religious context or a theological context, right? If we were created by divinity, the creator actually is the rightful owner, you could say, right? If just like an artist who creates something is, because they are the one that created it, they have property rights, right? They get to, have the trademark or whatever. They can copyright it, right? Because they created it. So that gives them legitimate property rights. So if humanity and nature, the earth, were created by an infinite and infinitely intelligent divine divine being, well, then that divine designer would be the rightful owner. So there's again this rebellious, satanic posture, you could say, against the creator, where it's, I'm going to take control of your property, right? Humanity, does rightfully belong to you, you could say, but I'm going to claim them as my property. And we see this, especially recently with, well, historically, slavery, of course, is a very old practice, but recently with claiming ownership over people's bodies in the form of medical tyranny, saying, well, you don't actually own your body. You don't actually have right to control your body. In the name of public safety, we get to usurp control of your own body. We actually, therefore, own your body, right? Because that's another aspect of property rights, is that the property owner gets to control their property, right? If you own your car, right, then you can modify your car, you can control your car because it's yours. But if it's someone else's car, you then don't have the right to do that, right? So the act of controlling, to be legitimate, depends on ownership. So they're claiming, the communists, the Marxists, the statists, they're claiming ownership of humanity, which actually stems from the devil's agenda, which is one and the same. And as I'll make more clear in the conclusion, this also includes claiming property, claiming ownership of the earth itself, right? Again, the earth is designed and made by the creator, so therefore, you could say God is the rightful owner of the earth, but they're claiming ownership of the whole earth, right? There's nowhere on the planet Earth where there is not a state, right? Each state borders another state. They've claimed ownership of the entire Earth, and everyone born, and therefore everyone born on Earth is born into their territory, right? That they supposedly are the rightful owners and controllers of, right? They're human farms, right? And you're the livestock born into their farm, which they supposedly have rightful ownership of, just like a livestock farmer, right? Say they have a farm of cows. When a new calf is born on their farm, right, they are considered the rightful owner of that calf, right? It was born into their farm, born into their territory, right? So the entire earth is being claimed by the state, by statists and by states globally as their own property, even though they won't say that exactly. Of course, it'll be said that this is just, their area of governance, which is, really just the people ruling themselves, blah, 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 political deception theater, right? Particular strategies they utilize in order to enforce that philosophy, or in order for that philosophy to become manifest, there's a few tactics that they use. and I'll talk about each in turn here, but one is divide and conquer. Um, Another is propaganda, just disseminating large amounts of disempowering propaganda. And then the third is just simply the use of force, just intimidation, violence, you could say totalitarianism or tyranny. So I'll start with that. So what are examples of that? Which all of the folks that are, under the so-called woke category and, pro-socialist, pro-Marxism, pro-communism, they're for all these things, but they don't see it as just means of empowering the state. They think they're actually, making the world a better place because they've been indoctrinated to believe that, mainly through schooling, universities in particular, which are, heavily, you could say, infiltrated and run by Marxists. So one key way to, control a population is to disarm them, right? That's just common sense. You don't even need to look at all the historical examples of, communist regimes disarming people before they become even more impressive. You can just think of it, although that would be a good exercise to to review, just that pattern of disarming and then oftentimes genocide following. But just think of it on a person-to-person level. Actually, Lenin, there's a quote on Lenin saying, one man with a gun can control 100 without one. And, just think of it on that level. Like, if someone wants to harm and control or abuse someone else, if that other person has a weapon that they can use to defend themselves, well, that's going to be an obstacle in you controlling them, right? So disarming them would be the first step in controlling them, right? It's just common sense. And that's what they do. And that's what, has been going on increasingly globally, especially in the United States, following tragedies which they then, publicize and use as supposed justification for them having further monopoly on weapons. Always in the name of public safety. But disarming nonviolent people, disarming the population is a key communist tactic. Another key form of, just coercion and violence is imprisonment, just criminalizing people that are not accepting of their totalitarianism, right? And this is, there's countless examples, like, again, Stalin with the gulags and Mao, Pol Pot, just, so many examples of, imprisoning people that were just resisting the tyranny in any form, right? You can look at empires going all throughout history, right? That's just a common tactic, right? Enslave and, capture, enslave, imprison anyone who's resisting, even though they might be right for resisting that slavery and tyranny, right? So that's just using brute force. And we see that recently too, like in China, with their imprisoning of anyone who protests or even just practices something like qigong or Falun Gong, right? Criminalizing any kind of independent activity that isn't, state approved. And of course, that goes on in North Korea and elsewhere. So that's a main tactic, and that's something to be wary of in countries that are more free, but where you hear them talking more and more about, criminalizing. They start labeling people more and more as, so-called domestic terrorists or extremists, right? These are all, it's all terminology to lead to like new laws, right? That supposedly justify, arresting and imprisoning anyone who goes against their control, goes against their tyranny. Another way they use force is by just breaking up any independent organizations. Of course, arresting and imprisoning people is one way, but another way they do that is by infiltrating and then, steering and smearing is called, where, there may be a group that is actually principled and trying to do something good for the community, and then they'll have state agents infiltrate it and steer them in a destructive direction, namely a violent one, and then use that as an excuse to like shut down the organization or just to have anyone in that organization that was principled, leave it because they don't like what it's become. That happens a lot. Like if you don't think that ever goes on, you're mistaken. That goes on quite a lot. As far as like what these alphabet agencies, FBI, CIA, and so on, like it's documented. Like these are things they do. They infiltrate organizations. Supposedly always. It's always in the interest of so-called national security and keeping everyone safe. But in fact, it's really fundamentally the theme is anything that goes against state power is going to be um, forcibly dismantled through this tactic of infiltration and steering and smearing. That's why, like, for example, if you look up the term sovereign citizen, all you're going to find is like a bunch of mugshots of like people that are, look mentally deranged or, are mentally handicapped. And, they just smear the whole movement of anybody trying to, claim independence or resist tyranny, anarchism, even on recently on the HBO channel or the HBO, cable network, they have a new show called The Anarchists, and um, some people have pointed out that the people that they're highlighting as the supposed like main representatives are the most questionable people, and so some of those people may have been actually installed there for this purpose of, infiltration, steering, and smearing. So like they can just paint all anarchists as like, you know, big into drugs and violence and, just all this craziness so that the entire movement is smeared, right? Another means of just using coercion and force to keep people in subjection is through poverty. And so, of course, taxation is a big means of that. It affects the poor more than the rich. Oftentimes, those with the most power and wealth can pretty much avoid a lot of the taxes, but it's the small business or the small or the individual in a small family that is going to be burdened the most. And this is furthered by not only taxing them but then using the taxes to then give to the already wealthy, like these supposed relief funds actually going to like big banks and big businesses. But meanwhile, like small businesses, particularly like run, if it's, a single man running a small business in his community, trying to make ends meet. He's not getting any funding or little to none. But a big corporation, I even heard about just around where I live, the local McDonald's was given $5 million in relief funds, even though they just had one of their most profitable years ever, right? So they didn't need the 5 million, but that's what they were given. And meanwhile, like local food banks are struggling to get by, lacking funds, and small businesses are being taken out, right? So they maintain control this way too by keeping people in a state of poverty. Also, a way to forcibly keep people down is to keep them unhealthy. So I think a huge example of this is, mentally and physically. So the promotion and dissemination of various toxins, namely fluoride, right? Water fluoridation, supposedly for our own good, right? But it's a known neurotoxin, proven beyond a doubt to lower IQ in children, right? So you dumb down, weaken, the mental faculty of the people. Who does that serve? It serves the powers that be, who certainly aren't drinking fluoridated water, just like you hear with the GMO companies. They actually eat organic because they don't want to harm themselves. Same with pharmaceutical manufacturers, vaccines. You may find that they're not actually taking these drugs, right? That they're actually protecting their bodies because they don't want to be harmed by um, these substances. Another big example is mercury, right? Just the fact that it's very commonplace still to this day to have people's teeth filled with toxic mercury, which is an extremely detrimental neurotoxin. Causes fatigue and you know mental issues. And aluminum is another one. Again, put in so-called medicines and even body care products. A lot of this is delivered actually via cooperation with corporations, and this is something I was going to mention later, where the supposed dichotomy between like the state and big business actually is a false dichotomy. That they're actually working together, oftentimes, and in big ways. For example, like big tech working with government to impose censorship, or big pharma working with government to impose medical tyranny. Right? They're working together in ways that fundamentally empower the state and profit the corporations too, of course. But these are the corporations that are really tools of the state, you could say, that are supporting greater state power. Another way, just before moving on, another way that they forcibly, you could say, keep people down is, again, by undermining things that would be empowering, or undermining things that would strengthen communities, right? So, again, with the same tactic of like infiltrating and steering and smearing, that goes on a lot with militias, right? They've been demonized and certainly have been oftentimes, infiltrated, again, supposedly, for the greater good. Another would be like even on technology, like a technology that would be empowering, whether it's, vehicles that can run on like homemade fuel, or things like that. Some folks even talk about like free energy devices being suppressed. I don't know about that, but I do know that certainly like having homemade ethanol for, like an E100 vehicle is certainly not something being promoted or even allowed, right? So anything that would like further your own energy independence and just independence overall of yourself, your family, and your community, oftentimes is undermined directly, forcibly and purposely. Okay, so the next major tactic that I mentioned is the divide and conquer tactic. So this actually is what the so-called cultural revolution that Marxists talk about is. Like the cultural revolution is basically just dividing people amongst themselves, against themselves. Um, Inner conflict within your own being, and then also within your community. And this is straight out of the Communist Manifesto, where it says, quote, that their ends can be attained only by forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. So existing social conditions, I would put into the context again of creation. So there's design in humanity and earth, and therefore society pre-existing, right? These ingrained attributes and the way we were designed to interact with one another, men with women, and humanity just all together, to dismantle all this and have people turn against themselves, against family, and undermine these existing social conditions, or undermine, you could say, the design of humanity. So ways in which this is done, especially in recent years, predominantly would be through the race war in particular, and now we have what's called critical race theory being forcibly pushed into schools to indoctrinate children with, which is just pushing racism. It's just a different form of racism, getting people to view each other as part of separate biological races, which are antagonistic with one another naturally, which is just false biologically. There isn't actually these distinct biological races, and it's not to say that racism doesn't exist. It certainly does, but by fanning the flames and actually encouraging racism, they're just making matters worse. They're taking an ignorant viewpoint and intensifying it to further divide and conquer. So this is fundamentally for the purpose of greater state power, because the main thing to keep in mind with divide and conquer, the main idea, the main goal is just to get people fighting amongst themselves, because if they're doing that, then they're not fighting against the powers that be, right? They're not uniting against their oppressors, right? They're fighting amongst themselves. They see each other as the problem. It's black versus white, man versus woman is preferable to the powers that be, right? Because it's not people versus, the slave masters, which is the fundamental dynamic, actually. Humanity being enslaved by these, you could say, devil-inspired control freaks or Satanists. So then we have the gender war, men versus women, and of course, with the feminist movement, there was a lot of encouragement, and continues to be a lot of encouragement of, women actually turning against men. Particularly the idea that men have a natural leadership role, just like women have their natural strengths and roles. Men have theirs, namely being a protector and a leader and provider, undermining all that, and encouraging women to actually try and take on the masculine qualities, become more manly, and then that is supposedly empowering to them. The irony being that this is actually anti-feminine, right? It's saying that your natural feminine nature is weak and bad and should be discarded. So it's actually an anti-woman philosophy and agenda being pushed as if it's pro-woman. So, getting men and women to have greater disharmony, because if men and women were designed in a way that is complementary, these different complementary roles, if you mix that up and you undermine it and you try and give the male roles to the women and the female roles to the men, and that's not the way they were designed, well, that's going to cause inevitable friction and disturbance and disharmony. It's just, you're going against the grain of creation, so it doesn't work. Natural attraction and chemistry and harmony are all undermined, but that again serves the powers that be. And along with the gender war, there's definitely been particular attack on natural masculinity because of that leadership role, which is a natural inclination of men, and you could say a natural strength, because the powers that be want to be leading everyone. They want to be controlling everyone. So you can't have a population with masculine, fully natural masculine men, because that would counter their power, right? You'd have an obstacle. You'd have all these men challenging their control. So the attack on masculinity has been especially evident and strong, especially through entertainment, just constantly promoting feminized men and demonizing, natural masculinity. It's just extremely widespread, and there's a lot of folks that have been pointing this out for many years, especially in recent years. So, if you just do a search on, the attack on masculinity or the feminization of men, the emasculation of men, black men in particular, it's very obvious and prominent that that's been going on. But again, to demystify this, it's simply the divide and conquer strategy. It's just another form of divide and conquer. And of course, then there's the political divide and conquer, like left versus right. But actually, these are just two sides of the same coin. So you got people fighting against each other, but they're not really fighting against the powers that be. They're just, going. It's just left versus right, conservative versus liberal, missing the big picture. So again, just classic divide and conquer. And returning to destruction of the family, a lot has actually been written and spoken about how Marxism is anti-family, and this isn't like theoretical. Like it's straight out of the Communist Manifesto, right? In Chapter 2, the abolition of the family, right? And direct quotes from Lenin about destroying the family. So it's not like conjecture, or it's not ad hominem. This distaste for the family, this anti-family sentiment is very out in the open among Marxists. And this anti-family sentiment, these ideas that actually break families apart, have definitely been purposely disseminated. Again, if you think like psychological warfare isn't something that government agencies take part in, I believe you're mistaken. I believe that's definitely something that they do. Actually, the beginnings of modern feminism in the United States have actually been connected to people that were supposedly ex-CIA agents who focused on black women in particular, with propagating this, or quote unquote educating them with these ideas, particularly the idea that the man being the leader in the household is oppressive. The idea of like raising a family, starting a family at a young age is oppressive, and that you should focus on your career and reject having a family, especially at a younger age, which was very disruptive, obviously, to the family structure, right? But beyond that, it's also been incentivized. Like being a single mother, you'll actually get more money from the government, right? But if you stay with the man, you'll lose that funding, right? So the government has been encouraging monetarily, women to leave their partners, leave their husband, their boyfriend. So obviously that breaks apart the family structure. Again, not a coincidence. Another way that it's been done is by incentivizing divorce, by making divorce very profitable to the woman and very easy for her. That it's like made to be a means of empowerment, actually, to divorce. And so that's become very commonplace, and most, because of that incentivization, if I'm saying that word right, because of that those benefits, namely financial benefits, now women initiate most divorces. And I'm not saying that every time a woman initiates a divorce it's because she's greedy. I'm saying certainly sometimes they divorce for legitimate reasons, just like a man might want to divorce a woman for legitimate reasons. But I'm saying it's been encouraged financially, right? Just like with the payments, like welfare payments for single mothers, it's actually incentivizing it, which I don't think is coincidental, because it serves, again, the destruction of the family, which serves greater power to the already powerful, more power to the state. Once you keep zooming out and seeing what the end result is, and how the end result is always the same for all of these various policies, you realize, okay, well, it's all actually part of the same agenda. But yeah, the attack on the family is really fundamental to Marxism because um, they don't want you to have allegiance to your family or God. They want your allegiance to be to the state, right? So um, breaking apart the family is key for their power, right? They know that strong families are the basis of an empowered society, empowered communities. So destroying families is actually a top priority for the state. And again, there's a lot of articles and books that have and talks that have been given on this topic of Marxism against family. Um, and the interesting thing too is to hear what some of the Marxists actually think about it. How they've been deceived into believing that the family is a bad thing. Um, so they'll think that families are um, actually the reason why society is as bad as it is. They think that they've actually been convinced that destruction of the family is what's going to like bring in this socialist utopia. Yeah, if you listen to what they say about the family, they'll say something like, "It's bad because it teaches acceptance of hierarchy, and also um, it's a means of passing wealth down from generation to generation, which they say um, furthers class inequality." So I can see how a young university student might hear that and be deceived. It sounds kind of legitimate. They might think, okay, yeah, I guess a family structure is kind of hierarchical, and I like the idea of equality, like everyone being treated fairly. So that seems contradictory. And then they think, oh yeah, what's this deal with inheritance? Like that doesn't seem fair either. You just happen to be born into a rich family and you get all this stuff, but if you're born into a poor family, you get nothing, right? So I can understand the train of thought. I think I actually had similar train of thought, back when I was in university, not coincidentally. Um, but the problem with that train of thought is that it's flawed in some key ways, and it's not actually skeptical of the state as a solution. So I wouldn't say that it is fair that, for example, some people, like Bill Gates, for example, is now the number one owner of farmland in the United States, right? I don't think that's a good thing. I'm not promoting that. I'm not saying that's social justice. I do think it's actually good if everyone had a fair share of land, water, and your own place to sleep at night. Your own garden, maybe a fruit orchard, fruit and nut tree orchard. Like equality of natural resources, or a fair distribution. And when I say distribution, I don't mean by the state. I just mean voluntary, recognizing that this is God's creation and we should share these key natural resources among ourselves fairly. Just like if you were on a boat or a plane and it crashed, and the survivor, everyone survived though, and they find an island, an uninhabited island. Like, what would be the fair thing to do? Well, if there's coconut trees and fresh water on the island, well, I think most people would agree that, okay, we should make sure everyone has access to these coconuts and fresh water, and no one should start dominating or ruling over anyone else. Let's give everyone a space. They can have their own privacy, and just treat each other in a caring way, like recognizing natural resources are special in that we need them for survival, right? And we need them for independence and freedom and privacy. So therefore, it's just logical and ethical to make sure everyone has access to a fair share of that, right? That's not communist. That's not, at all unjust. But it's also not, just narrow-minded capitalism that just sees, land, water, and seed as any other resource, and would approve of billionaires buying all the land. ignorantly ignoring the fact that land is fundamental for freedom and survival, right? So I say all that to kind of meet the Marxists halfway, or to try and point out to them, if your instinct or your intention is like real equality, treating people fairly on the earth in a true sense of social justice, well, then I would agree with you. But your belief that the state is the means of achieving that is ridiculous. It's just, so you couldn't be more wrong. Historically and just down to the present day, it's just shown to be not at all the means to establishing that. You're giving the already powerful more power, which just corrupts them even further. It doesn't actually result in what you're wanting, which is, like peace, love, justice, harmony. The mistaken viewpoint is really fundamentally collectivism. This idea that, like, in order for there to be like collective harmony, we have to all assimilate to a collective program. But that's not actually the way it works, because that's not the actual way to achieve social justice. Because by undermining the right of the individual, by committing that unethical act, and by empowering this collective that supposedly is, under everyone's control, this idea of representation, or again, the dictatorship of the proletariat, it's just delusional. Like, it's not actually reality. That's not actually how it operates. How it operates is that you have a ruling party ruling over everyone else, right? And calling it justice and calling it equity. And the way that, socialist-minded folks, Marxists, communists, have been deceived, the ones with good intentions, which I think is a lot of them, especially, youth and universities, is that they think that by the way to end poverty, the way to end this injustice of, vast disparity of wealth to the point where people are starving, right, which is honest, right, is by empowering the state and by undermining men in particular, undermining families, and by abolishing capital and private property. Like, they think that they've been convinced that that's the means to achieve the end they want, but it's not. It actually does the opposite, right? That's because the devil is a deceiver, and he's deceiving for the purpose of causing greater disharmony and greater destruction, going against God's original perfect design, which does promote harmony and justice and peace and love in the world. They're following the false authority. They're following the devil when they should be following the Creator. A quote from Marx himself, he wrote this to Engels, who was the co-author of the Communist Manifesto. Marx said, "Blessed is he who has no family," right? So this is, again, fundamental to Marxism, the destruction of the family. Along with abolishing the right of inheritance, ending home and religious education, right? That was key, and you see that now with the criminalization, and discouragement of homeschooling. But another way that's achieved indirectly is through economic oppression and poverty, right? Where the family can't afford to just stay at home with the kids, right? Because they have to pay the property tax, right? In large part, they have to pay for food and shelter and water, which actually are birthrights, which were given to us all freely by the Creator, because the state, the social system as a whole, has us in an unjust situation wherein we have to pay them, we have to pay other people just to live on the planet, right? That's the fundamental root injustice, having to pay other people just to live on the planet Earth, because that's the established, because that's the status quo. Homeschooling, a lot of folks that would like to homeschool their kids, maybe they don't like what's going on in the school with the drugging of kids, and the indoctrination, pushing masks and vaccines and other drugs, against so-called, all these so-called disorders that are oftentimes just the kid being unhappy in this unnatural um, educational structure, forced to sit for hours at a time, etc. Right, so destruction of the family, in part is um, by stripping, taking kids away from their parents, even when the parents don't really want the kids to go, but they economically are coerced into that position, right? Because again, they need to earn money elsewhere, and so they have to have someone watch the kids while they're at work, right? So, you know, this was a key, idea of Marx, right? Like again, back to the Communist Manifesto, getting children into daycares and nurseries and so-called community collectives, getting them away from the family, right? So that they can be educated by the state or indoctrinated by the state so that they can have further control, right? Because if you indoctrinate the kids at, from a young age, well, then again, that serves the powers that be. They're more easily controlled if you convince them that everything's hunky-dory, like, oh, this status quo is totally good and the state is your true parent, your true God and Savior, and just keep serving and obeying them, and you're a good person. Again, it's going against the Creator. It's there's different factions of Marxism and communism, but a common theme you'll notice is that they're all, uh, you know, they all seem to have this visceral reaction against the idea of a creator who's actually designed humanity a certain way, men and women in particular. Um, that gets them upset. They become unstable and reactionary and argumentative and dismissive. Uh, whenever that's brought up, they just fundamentally hate that. And I think that, is pointing to the devilish philosophy or spirit behind all of this political ideology. It's actually has this wicked spiritual underbelly. And of course, a huge example of that is actually abortion, right? Of course, that breaks up families, would-be families, by the normalization of infanticide. And that, of course, you could say um, has a strong connection with Satanism, right? Because actually abuse and sacrifice, so-called sacrifice, just the murder of children, is a known satanic practice, right? So actually murdering babies, and especially it's even more obvious when their view is to the extreme, where they're saying, up until the ninth month or even right after birth, it's okay, right? When these are um, clearly babies that are individuals, clearly they feel pain, um, and should be respected as individuals, but they're saying no, it's okay to murder them, right? There's a there's an insane satanic spirit to that. I think it is fair to say when you see some of these folks like almost like frothing at the mouth at the idea of abortion, like they revel in it, and that kind of shows again. It gives you a glimpse of what the real spirit of these of this Marxist ideology is. But again, it's serving the same fundamental purpose of greater state power by breaking up families. The strongest defense against communism is actually strong families, strong communities, and belief in the Creator and awareness of the Creator, and following the greatest commandments of Jesus, of Yeshua the Messiah, who gave us the perfect moral law to love God and to love others and ourselves, which is a law against abuse, because the opposite of loving action is abusive action. And that's why all of this Marxist ideology, all of this um, attempt to gain greater power, it's power to abuse, right? That's what they want to use the power to do, is to be more abusive, because it's devil inspired. It's against the Creator. The Creator is pro-love, pro-freedom. They're pro-abuse, pro-slavery. And I think I may have mentioned that the divide and conquer strategy actually even includes a war against yourself. So, what I mean by this is, again, we were designed by a creator. And so, if we're going against our own design, that's going to create internal conflict and trouble. We're going to not be in harmony with reality because we're going against the way it was designed to function in a harmonious way. And again, this is very evident with male-female relations, where that's just being undermined by masculinizing the woman and feminizing the man, and just turning them against each other altogether, or trying to just destroy the idea of separate genders altogether. With transgenderism, and again with the anti-family sentiment, where they're actually state schools are having children question their own gender identity and encouraging them to like identify as a different gender, and oftentimes against the wishes of the parent. And I've heard even going to such insane extremes of encouraging like drug or hormone therapy to like further them in the direction of their new gender choice. It's anti-family and anti self-identity, anti your own actual design as you were created. So it's multiple attacks on creation and multiple forms of divide and conquer. So now we'll move on to the propaganda tactic, and just give some of the major examples of main ideas or main beliefs that are pushed, that are extremely disempowering. And again, that just serves the powers that be, right? Divide and conquer gives more power to the powers that be. Disempowering propaganda, right? Obviously disempowering to the population, but thereby empowering the already powerful who want to rule and control over that population. So a big example of propaganda that's disseminated is Darwinian evolution theory, the idea that macroevolution is a fact, that one species turning into another species is true, that your ancestry can be traced back to pond scum, right? Not coincidentally, a derogatory term, right? Scum. So you come from scum is something they want you to believe, subliminally or subconsciously. But if you look into it, if you manage to get away from all of the BS so-called science that they're pushing, with all of these fabricated fossils and mislabeling of, species of apes as supposed, transitionary species. They believe that, bananas are your cousin. It's just a whole hot mess of nonsense. But because there is a lot of solid science that would need to be discussed, a couple of books that really do a good job of like giving a large part of the evidence, and just serve as a good introduction on why intelligent design science is actually true to reality and macroevolution is not. So Dr. Jonathan Wells wrote a book called Icons of Evolution, and then a more recent one called Zombie Science. Excellent books. Zombie Science in particular, like, it might be best to pick up first. Another author, Stephen Meyer, wrote a book called Darwin's Doubt, and then another one called Signature in the Cell, DNA and the Evidence for Intelligent Design. So if you're just not familiar with all of the scientists that have given expert, analysis and presentation of the evidence that macroevolution is false and actually intelligent design is clearly the reality, I recommend you delve into those books to start with, and you can listen to talks by them as well, and then do further research. But in the context of this talk, my point being that the idea that you weren't actually created by your origin is not divine. It's the complete opposite. It's just pond scum, right? That's disempowering. Like, you should be able to recognize that that's not, the idea that you come from pond scum is disempowering versus that you come from divinity. The truth being that you are made in the image and likeness of a perfectly good divine creator, right? That's actually empowering. So they don't want you to believe that. So hence Darwinism is heavily pushed, even to this day. And it may morph into something else. They may, as Darwinian evolution is, more and more debunked and more people realize it's just propaganda, they may shift tactics and then say, oh, well, you're actually created by aliens or something like that, but it'll never be it'll never be the truth that it's the perfectly good divine creator. They're going to say, oh, it's the Anunnaki or whatever they're going to come up with. Or they're just going to say it's all virtual reality or whatever, anything but the truth, which is that, you're actually a creation of God. On the propaganda front, especially with movies and entertainment, patriotism, of course, is huge. And this is actually well documented, like for example, like CIA involvement in Hollywood. Like, this isn't like, if you've never heard that before, you might think, well, it just sounds like wacko conspiracy theory. Actually, no, they do. Intelligence agencies do get involved with media. They do get involved with movies and even public, and with education and so on. The governing of the mind, which is actually, the etymology or, the root meanings of the word government, right? Govern means control. Ment comes from mente or mind, right? So the governing of the mind is actually fundamental to government. It's not all just this exterior or external, political control, coercive control. It actually relies, you could say, in most part, on governing the mind. Because if you don't believe in their rule, well, then you're probably going to resist. If you realize you're just being enslaved and that these people are deceptive, satanic control freaks, you're probably not going to be, endorsing them or voting for them or, promoting them. So it's more a mental game, you could say, overall. And so that's why the psychological manipulation and warfare is very much a reality. And so they're always going to be made out to be the good guy, the savior, and the means of freedom and justice in the world. But that's constantly contradicted by history and reality. Even when there's good principles written on the paper, there's no actual reason to think that they're held to those principles, right? Like, you can look at all these communist regimes and, all these horrible dictators, and they can actually have constitutions that talk about individual rights and so on, and equality and justice, but they just don't follow it. And a big reason, or, you could say an obvious reason, is because they don't have to. There's no negative consequence, right? They're being paid regardless, right? You're being forced to fund them regardless. It doesn't, oh, you don't like who the options are to vote for? Well, they're going to install one of them anyway. It's not like you can say none of the above, right? One of them is going to be put in power, or they're going to, steal the election or whatever. Or if, if you vote for the wrong person, they'll just won't count your votes, right? One way or another, like, it doesn't, your disagreement doesn't actually make any difference as far as whether they're going to still have the power or not, right? Your income is still being taxed. Your property is still being taxed. If you live in a state where there's sales tax, every transaction is funding them. It doesn't matter if you disagree with where the tax dollars are going, right? You don't want it going towards all these various Marxist agendas and, destructive practices and violence. Well, okay, that's good that you don't want those things, but it doesn't change the fact that that's where it's going, right? You don't actually have any control over it, right? This idea that we are the government, that we are in control, is just fantasy. It's just political theater. And as far as the Constitution goes, I've mentioned before, like the Bill of Rights. What's good about the Bill of Rights is that's actually just, in some respects, in large respect, just reiterating natural law, which is the law against abuse. So it's saying the government doesn't have the right to abuse you by restricting your speech or by restricting your practice of religion, right? So because of that resonance with natural law, a lot of people um, respect, the Constitution, or at least respect those aspects of it. But other portions need more careful look, more careful analysis. Like, in particular, the 16th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, right? This was put in 1913. And interestingly, what it put in place is something right out of the Communist Manifesto, which is income tax. So one of the pillars of communism, via, again, the Communist Manifesto, is to establish an income tax, along with central banks, which were also established around the same time, right? So this is not out of the Declaration of Independence. This is not out of 1776. This is out of the Communist Manifesto. Also worth a second look, or more careful reading, is the 13th Amendment, which is simply known as the Amendment Against Slavery. But if you actually read the amendment, it says, "No slavery, quote, except if duly convicted of a crime," end quote. So if the government says you committed a crime, well, then it's okay for you to be enslaved. Wow. Okay. How come no one's talking about that? I'm talking about how problematic that is because, as I've said before, governments, communist governments in particular, can criminalize dissent, right? So if they criminalize dissent, and say you organize a protest, or you just speak against the government, well, okay, now you're a criminal. And so now, according to the 13th Amendment here, and of course, in other countries as well, they'll have similar wordings. It's okay to be enslaved. Slavery is okay if you're convicted of a crime. So, exceptions to the rule, exceptions to the law of love, right? Jesus didn't say, it's about loving others except if the government says you're a criminal, right? Of course not. So it's all these supposed exceptions to the rule where abuse is supposedly justified. It's like, yeah, normally extortion is wrong. It would be wrong for you to commit extortion against your neighbor. Oh, but it's okay if these guys do it because they're special, right? They have this special right. This is exceptional. There's this whole political theater in place which makes that extortion okay. Really? Well, no, not really, right? So it's just deception. Um, you know, Again, closer look could be given to the 14th Amendment, um, that you're no deprivation of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Without due process of law. So, with due process of law, therefore, logically, we can infer that this states that with due process of law, you can be deprived of life, liberty, and property. Right? So, what is due process of law? Well, it's basically whatever the government says it is. Right? They're the ones that make the law. Right? You might think it's more complicated than that. Oh, there's checks and balances and so on. But basically, they make the laws. You don't, right? It's like this idea that we are the government and that we're making the laws, and we're committing the extortion. It's just false. So if they say due process of law has been carried out, they can take away your life and your liberty, right? Same with the 13th Amendment. If you've been duly convicted of a crime, well, who defines what the crime is? Well, they do. So I just think it's, worth a closer look there. And then with the Fourth Amendment, search and seizure, invasion of privacy is restricted, which is good. That's keeping with the law of love, the law against abuse, right? Privacy invasion is an abusive act. If, though, it's unreasonable, right? Quote unquote unreasonable. Well, guess what? The NSA, CIA, all these folks, right? Guess what they think is reasonable? It may not be what you think is reasonable, right? So They get to define what's reasonable and unreasonable, and so it's just a free pass. They can just say, oh well, it's a time of war. We've declared a war on terrorism, or we declared a war on whatever. Um, and so now it maybe wasn't reasonable yesterday, but now it's reasonable. You know, so you're just giving them this free pass. All they have to do is say the word emergency, and then they have emergency powers. All I have to do is say, well, it is reasonable. Oh, okay. Well, they said it's reasonable. So now they can do whatever search and seizure they want. They can, invade your home, steal your stuff. It's reasonable because they say so. They can take away your life, liberty, and property if they say a due process of law. Oh, they wrote on this paper, it's called a warrant, and, they had it pass hands from a judge, this other person. So there's your due process. Okay, it's legit now. So legitimized abuse, right? There is no such thing, right? So this is, again, demystifying what's really going on. It's the devil wanting to abusively control humanity by deceiving them into thinking that sometimes abuse is okay, right? By convincing you, oh, well, these are legitimate powers and their abusive acts are actually caretaking, Just finish on the propaganda front by just mentioning, of course, like Hollywood, just filled with it. Not only, the ultra patriotism, but also with uh, the gender mixing and undermining and even darker, shadier stuff. Like actual more Satanism coming to the surface, like we've seen with like certain entertainment figures, where like their concerts are basically like satanic rituals out in the open. And then even with like the Satanic Church, getting promoted, and they're even putting up these statues of Satan, or whatever that goat creature they call, the statues of the devil, right? And calling it legit, it's just a whole hot mess of disempowering, dark propaganda found in Hollywood, and outlets like Netflix, like pretty much all of that. Even the stuff you think is like cool, or a lot of times it's what seems like cool and edgy, like is actually what's got the worst propaganda in it, because they're able to reach you through that packaging of, oh, this is cool and edgy, but it's really just to get you receptive to it. And another huge example of that, in sort of a different way, as far as the receptivity, is through advertising, because your guard is down. You just think like advertisements and billboards and magazine ads and TV ads and radio ads. You might just label all that in your mind as like, oh, these are just businesses selling products, and that's all you think it is. And you might think, oh yeah, they kind of use manipulative tactics, like getting you to think that this product is going to make you happy, or get this product associated with like a happy home and family, or even like fun and sex. And yeah, that's true, but it's worse than that. It's deeper than that. For example, a lot of times it's not at all about selling a product at all. It's not about making these associations with the product. It's not even an advertisement. I think it's just like you could say an intelligence ad that they're putting out. It's just psychological warfare. It's not at all about selling anything. And oftentimes this is made clear because what is said in the very first few seconds is the most toxic. And so that's because, I believe without a doubt, it's so that, before you can change the channel, before you can mute it, you're hit with this disempowering idea, which may not seem disempowering unless you think about it, unless you analyze it. So to give a couple recent examples of, one that I think most people probably would never guess is propaganda. It was just an advertisement where the first few seconds, it said in a loud, like kind of impactful voice, complication is everywhere, right? So you might think, well, how is that propaganda? It's propaganda because it's pushing a belief that is actually very disempowering. If you believe the world is this complicated, confusing mess. That's disempowering. If you don't actually recognize the simple truth of reality, again, that you were created in the image and likeness of God, that we are commanded to be loving towards others, ourself, and the Creator, that the natural world is a good thing, and politics is a bad thing. Actually having like very clear black and white understanding of reality is discouraged, right? And confusion is promoted. So simple truth is brushed aside, and just a bunch of confusion and psyops and false, out there conspiracy theories and all kinds of things are put out just to keep people confused and on edge, which is, a way of disempowering. It's actually, I'm just remembering now, like the book 1984 by George Orwell, right? Like just this constant, flipping the script on like who's the good guy, who's the bad guy, and keeping people always in a state of instability, right? In a state of confusion is a main tactic, right? Because if everyone is confused, they're disempowered. So actually hitting people with this statement of complication is everywhere is actually disempowering propaganda. Another one I heard just recently, that's why it's fresh in my mind, is and again, I have no idea what the ad was for, because I did mute it as soon as I could, but again, I couldn't mute it quick enough to avoid the initial toxic message, which was, God doesn't care if you're angry, right? It's like, who knows what that was a supposed advertisement for? I mean, again, I don't think it has ads like this to have nothing to do with about selling a product. They're about instilling a toxic, disempowering message in your mind. And so why is that disempowering? Because anger is actually a demonic emotion thought that is disempowering. So if you think it's okay to just exercise anger, be filled with anger all the time, well, they actually want that, just like they want you to be instilled with fear all the time, because that comes from the enemy too. To just go on a brief tangent here on a spiritual, psychological side, I've identified 8 emotion thoughts, which I believe are pure sabotage, purely toxic, and come from the enemy. And our work, you could say, our spiritual duty is to actually work at conquering each of these. So those are fear, sloth, anger, depression, suspiciousness, craving, mischievousness, and conceitedness. So, fear and anger and craving being, very predominant. Fear especially is, something that they're pushing. And most people recognize that, but I don't think most people recognize that fear is actually completely demonic and sabotaging. It has no redeeming values. And if you doubt that, I recommend please listening to my previous talks on fear, in particular, the most recent one titled Top 3 Pro-Fear Ideas Debunked, where I explain where the supposed redeeming versions of fear, the redeeming qualities of fear, actually are not real. They're messaging that is deceptive to get you to still accept it as a supposedly good part of your life. So that's propaganda, and so to conclude, I just want to wrap up again with the big picture and also point out what is the opposite of all this. Okay, so if what they're pushing is all deception and disempowerment, well then what is the truth that's empowering? It's going to be the complete opposite of what they're pushing. And this is something that both those on the left and right are not getting. They've actually both been turned away from what the liberating truth is. Whether you're conservative or leftist, they both, for different reasons, have been tricked into thinking that the actual truth and actual solution is a bad thing. So, fundamentally, it's about getting you to be pro-abuse, a pro-abuse idol worshiper. So, one way or another, to see the state as, legitimate authority, legitimate ruling class over society, that their abuse is legit. So, getting you to violate the greatest commandments by supporting abuse getting you to be an idol worshiper, right? Have no idols, remember, and thereby, not putting your worship and devotion and loyalty where it belongs, which is to your own Creator and to your own Savior, Jesus, I would say. Whether you believe in Jesus or not, I hope you can agree that loving action is good and abusive action is bad. Freedom is good, slavery is bad. It's fundamental ethics. But it's fundamentally just about going against his sovereignty, going against his authority, going against his design, right? In all ways, with the gender roles, but beyond that. Genesis 1:29 clearly states, and makes sense, that a loving Creator would have us not cause suffering to other species, right? Genesis 1:29, all these plants are to be your food, but we've been convinced that actually, enslaving and murdering animals is totally fine. They say, Jesus ate fish, which is just a huge cover-up. Just to briefly mention that, I recommend reading the book, The Lost Religion of Jesus and Disciples by Keith Akers. That just points out that, like, at the time of Jesus, actually, entire communities were plant-based, vegetarian, vegan. That was very common, actually. And there's actually a lot of evidence that he was as well, and that he was very much against not only the sacrifice of animals at the temple, but the killing of animals and eating of animal flesh altogether. So that abusive activity has been, both left and right people have been deceived into thinking is totally fine. But again, it goes against the original design, right? In paradise, for Adam and Eve, they were eating plants, they were eating fruits. They weren't slitting the throats of animals. And Jesus certainly wasn't, holding a baby lamb and then 5 minutes later slitting that lamb's throat. It's actually a blasphemous notion. But also, as far as the dominion goes, as part of our original design, if you look up the word dominion in a dictionary, as I did, the definition, the synonym, is sovereignty. So have sovereignty over the land, have sovereignty over the earth, right? So that means have your own sovereign space, right? Have control over natural resources that you need to survive, right? So both left and right have been convinced that this is actually a bad idea, right? Autonomous zones have been, skewed, have been put in the media just only as this, like, downtown of a city riot scene, to get you to associate autonomy or an autonomous zone with that. The idea of sovereign homesteads is just nowhere to be found, left or right, right? So the actual answer that would be true social justice, which would be recognizing that land, water, and seed are a birthright, and that to be disconnected from this communist, control freak social system apparatus, we actually need to have sovereign space, which we can then form strong communities by, right? An ethical foundation for society, true social justice. That's nowhere to be found. So everyone is being steered away from what the real solution is, one way or the other. If you ask a Marxist, what do you think about sovereign homesteads? They'll say, oh no, that's a terrible idea. We have to abolish all private property. But if you ask a conservative, what do you think about sovereign homesteads? Oh no, that's anarchism. That's, we can't have that. That's undermining the nation, or, they're going to have a negative reaction too. So both have been convinced that the actual solution is a bad thing. That freedom, that dominion, again, definition of dominion, sovereignty, that the original plan for humanity, which, again, you can just logically infer, again, from thinking of a scenario like, if you were to just land on an uninhabited island with a bunch of other people, what would you do, right? Well, again, you would share the land, water, and seed with one another. So I talk about this more in other previous talks on this topic about sovereign homesteads if you want to hear more and contemplate that more. But my point here being that all of this mess, all of this cultural Marxism, all of socialism, communism, is all to deceive you into accepting abuse and slavery. And the opposite of that is love and freedom. And an expression of love and freedom is that uninhabited island scenario, common reaction or common, um, action that people would take in a scenario like that, recognizing like, well, it actually is, you could say the same scenario for all of us everywhere, right? We're born on the earth, and what should we do? We should look around and say, okay, we all need food, clothing, we all need food, water, and land for self-sufficiency, for survival. We didn't create any of this. Whether you believe in the creator or not, it certainly wasn't created by man. The earth wasn't created by man. And that ties in again to the corruption, that the devilish corruption that they want to not only control humanity and distort humanity and have them go against their own design, but they're so intent on destroying nature, right? With genetic engineering, they want to destroy the natural order and replace it with their own version, right? They want to engineer and control life. They're playing God, right? That's what genetic engineering is. They're getting down to the genetics, the DNA, the design down to the genetic level and trying to play God. And it's not helping humanity. It's just making things more unhealthy, more disturbances, more serves the purpose of giving them even greater power. So I hope I was able to explain how the connection between Satanism and statism, as expressed most obviously through what we call Marxism, cultural Marxism, communism, is a very real phenomenon, that there really is this connection, and that it goes all the way back to the beginning, right? Like as illustrated in the Bible, that this connection between Satan having control over the states of the world, over these ruling authorities, is a very real thing. Again, that's why the devil was able to offer it to Jesus, because he was in control of it. And we can see that same spirit of control, that same spirit of abuse and deception at play to this day. And just to finish on this, the spirit of the enemy, at play, it can also be observed in the behavior of those that have been really indoctrinated by this doctrine, indoctrinated by Marxism, we could say, in modern times. And one big way is that, especially young folks that are big into Marxism, socialism, and just the whole woke, philosophy, whole woke viewpoint, is that, in my experience, my observation, they tend to slander very often, like almost every other sentence. It's like, I think it's fair to say most conversations, or a large proportion of the conversations they have with other people, among themselves, within their clique of, woke people, is that they slander a lot. They just constantly are labeling people, right? They love to label people unjustly, right? They'll label people shady, they'll label them racist, they'll label them misogynist, they'll call people Nazis. Oh, which, by the way, is ironic, right? Because the Nazi Party was actually socialist, right? What was their name? I wrote it down here. The Socialist Worker Party, right? That was who the Nazis were, right? So they constantly calling, people racist and so on, misogynist, or just anyone that's a little different, anyone that isn't like part of a collective, anyone who's like an actual individual doing their own thing, they're quick to label them as strange or a stalker or anything like that. They just love slandering. And the root word, the interesting thing here in the connection with the devil is that the root of the word devil, I believe in Latin, is means the slanderer. The devil is fundamentally a slanderer. And so it's, I think, not coincidental that those that are big on this satanic Marxism also happen to be big time slanderers, right? Because that is also part of the spirit of the enemy. And they also tend to be, unstable and aggressive, right? They're just oftentimes very confrontational in a way that isn't legitimate, causing disturbances that aren't justified. And another thing I've just noticed, incidentally, is that in their language, they oftentimes call things crazy or call things insane. Like they have a strong overuse of the words crazy and insane about things that aren't crazy and insane. It's just like, they just go for a walk down the street and they probably called, 5 or 10 things crazy or insane. Um, and I know that might seem like I'm nitpicking here, but I just think it's interesting because it fits into the idea of psychological projection, that they're actually projecting their own qualities or delusion on others, but they're quite oblivious to it. And also, they're big on surveillance, being part of that like whole snitch culture and using their phones to like video other people and record other people and then share it with their clique again and slander even more. So very collectivist minded and uh, in an aggressive way. Oftentimes, mainly to exercise slander, which again is the root characteristic, you could say, of the devil, right? The devil started, his campaign, you could say, his first activity was slandering God, right? Making God out to be a tyrant. But meanwhile, again, that's psychological projection, just like much of what these woke Marxists promote can be pointed out as hypocritical, right? Like critical race theory, for example, is just racism against people with light skin and calling it anti-racism, so on and so forth. There's so many examples where it's like, it's okay when they do it, but not okay when anyone else does it. This hypocrisy, this slander, was from the very beginning. It's the spirit of the enemy, spirit of the devil, slandering God with his own characteristic of being abusive and being controlling and being a tyrant. God is none of those things, but the enemy, the devil is. And so anyone who is operating under the spirit of the enemy is going to, to large degree, carry on those characteristics behaviorally. So, in final conclusion here, just to hit on the positive note of what is the actual solution, I would say it would be voluntary communities of sovereign veganic homesteads wherein people are actually following the non-aggression principle, following the non-abuse principle, not committing aggression, deception, or theft against one another, recognizing each other as sovereigns, as children of the Most High who have a birthright to these natural resources so that we can live as free men and women and not be ruled over and not be enslaved. All right, thanks for listening.